Good morning. We're talking with Dr. Allan Herrington, who's lived on Grand Lake since they bought the old Cedar Blade house in 1980. And he's going to share with us some of his pleasant experiences up here and his knowledge of the old wood boats. Al, go ahead.
There are certainly many people who are more knowledgeable about the wooden boats on Grand Lake than I am. Kevin Cox and his dad, of course, took care of the wooden boats here for many years and knew each of their personalities very well. And they are like people. Steve was mentioning to me the Topeka. She used to come around the lake at 6 o'clock every evening in the first few years we were here, and you could almost set your clock by the time the Topeka came around the lake. She was down in the cove with the Morals, and she had been there for literally ever. She dated somewhere to the 1940s, I think. And you could tell her engine, you could hear her engine. It was kerplank, kerplank, kerplank. A little bit different than the engines in the 1950s, which are a typical sound. Those were the post-war Chris Crafts, known as a group of collectible boats, of which there are many on the lake still. I just saw over the weekend Six Peaks is an 18-footer that's been refurbished, belonged to the Peaks down in the east end of the lake. They also had an early three-seater, which was a larger boat. It was one of the three-seat Chris Crafts that was on the lake, and it burned when the back of the marina burned back in the 1940s. At that time, the three-seaters were fairly rare at Grand Lake, meaning two seats up front and one little cubby seat for two people in the back. The ones that I remember were certainly Lady of the Lake. The owners of the restaurant on the west end of the lake owned it for many, many years.
That was the Pipers.
I believe it dates back to them.
Yeah, Les Piper, I think, at the Dave and Haven.
That boat was originally ordered from Chris Craft by Mrs. Mellinger, who was Captain Mac's daughter. She ran the marina during World War II when all the men were off to war. She ran the marina, and she put in an order immediately after the war to Chris Craft for a twin-engine Chris Craft, so it would have more power at this altitude. And Chris Craft sent her back a very nice letter, which I used to have a copy of, saying, "I'm sorry, we don't put two engines in a boat of that length. It's too much power." And so she wrote back to them and said, at this altitude, the engines lose so much power that Chris Craft will be getting a bad name because it doesn't have the power, and this would help correct that. And so they accepted her order and built Lady of the Lake, which was one of the most beautiful boats on the lake, and today is quite a collector's boat because it has two complete sets of instruments on the front. Most twin-engine boats today have their power integrated into a single set of instruments, but Lady of the Lake had two sets of instruments, one for each six-cylinder engine, and it made it a very powerful boat even on Grand Lake. And as recently as 3 or 4 years ago, it won Best Maintained Chris Craft in the United States down in Florida at the annual meeting of the Antique and Classic Boat Society. It was refinished by a fellow in Michigan. The owner of Dave and Haven had sought out his help in some minor repairs and felt obligated maybe to him have it when he sold it, and it sort of made the rounds, and today is in Atlanta, Georgia, I think, a southern boat. At that time, there was a 3-cockpit at the in the boathouse, which now is adjacent to the Bullocks, or if I can.
It's the one that Brooks have?
No, that's one of Marilyn Ronlove's little Chris's that was down in the east end of the lake that the Brookses have, which is a beauty. This belonged to the people that had the house that burned across the lake in the 1940s, and was 6 floors.
Oh, Mallow.
Mallow's from Milling and Elevator Company in Denver. And I had an interest in that boat because it was known as a hacker craft, 3 cockpits. Was a kind of a awful lot of wood in a 3 cockpit, and Kevin's dad put it in the back of the marina where it just took up room for several years, being so much boat as a three-seater or 3 cockpits. And I asked him one day what he was going to do with it, and he says, well, I think I will burn it, and after I save the engine. And I said, oh, that would be a terrible shame. So for a few $100s, I took it off his hands. So it didn't get burned. It later got restored. I kept it in a barn down in our ranch in Rye, Colorado, and a fellow was looking at some other boats back there, and he said, hey, that's a hacker craft there, isn't it? And I said, I think it is. And he said, I'll take it up to Seattle and refinish it. So he did, and he named it Rye, after the little town of Rye where our ranch was. And he had to take it out in a snowstorm, I recall. And so it was memorable for him. And he took it up to Seattle and refinished it to perfection. It had a 150 Gray Marine engine in it. And the first trip it took after he refinished it and rebuilt it was up to Orcas Island, which was a good full day's travel up the Puget Sound. So he depended on the boat to get him there, and it worked out fine. He still has that boat on Lake Washington, and we had a chance to see it last year when we were up there. The little fancy boats after World War II were the little racing runabouts, of which there were 2 on the lake. They were called the Red and Whites because the majority of them were painted red and white. And there were 2 of them that used to race on the lake all the time. One belonged to Joyce Hall, and that boat is still making the rounds of boat shows. I think one of his grandsons has followed it up. They were fast little boats, a little bigger engine than the standard 95 horsepower that the Chris Crafts came out with after World War II. Most of those were underpowered for Grand Lake. They were okay down at Lakeside, the amusement park in Denver, and he got a new one every year, so I refinished his old ones for a couple years. They were good little boats, but they didn't have much power with an inline 6. I think it was 95 horsepower. People tried blowers on them and lots of other things. You can always tell a lakeside boat up here at the boat shows because it has a split engine hatch. In back, that hatch is just one big piece of wood when you try and lift it. So down at Lakeside, in order to service them, he split it down the center, added another hinge on the other side, and another handle, and you could lift two small pieces instead of one, so the boats were easy to service. So occasionally on Grand Lake, I will see a one coming around the lake, and I'll look with the glasses and see that it has a split engine hatch cover.
Can you tell a lot about the boats by listening to them? Have you grown accustomed to their different sounds?
Yes, they're pretty much grouped. The group after World War II, those were 95 horsepower and eventually 105 horsepower. They have a very particular sound. Then in '61 there was quite a revolution at Chris-Craft, and they upped the power to the 130s and 131s. And they have a different sound. They're a much more capable power plant. They're much better for water skiing than the immediate post-war boats were. They made a ski boat right after World War II. Jenny Lemon, who owned Lemon Lodge, had one of the ski boats, and there was another one on the lake. They had sort of a flat bottom on the back, and they were a little wider at the back. They were a wonderful boat to water ski behind. They turned easily, and I still see one occasionally on Grand Lake, real collector's boats. Along in the early 1950s, well, I should say the 1960s, the 61 had the white tail fins. Nana, which is a 21-foot Chris-Craft, belonged to Marilyn Ronlove, had a big engine in it. It was a big V8, the same one that the Lincoln had in it, so it's known as the Lincoln Kennedy 430. And it's a huge engine. It used to be that she was the only one that would drive that boat between the yacht club and their house on the west end of the lake, and I never knew exactly why until she blew out the cylinder out through the sidewall one day and ruined the engine, and sort of was considering selling the boat to Tahoe Marine for a very modest sum, and I said that rather than that, maybe she'd like to keep it on the lake, and I could certainly match any price they would give. So for a very small sum, I purchased Nana, and then had the project of finding a 430, and 430 cubic inches is a big engine that came in the Lincoln Kennedy era of the suicide doors that opened on the old Lincolns. And so I put an ad in Wooden Boat, ran it for almost 2 years. Never could find anyone who had a Lincoln 430 Kennedy engine that they were willing to part with, or even the parts to rebuild one. Finally, after a couple years, a gentleman from Texas called and he said, "I think there are 2 of those in my cabin cruiser out in the barn." He said, "You'd certainly be welcome to either one of them." He said, "I know which one's the better one and be glad to give it to you." So with that wonderful offer, I shipped the 430 Lincoln engine up to Kevin in the marina, and he passed it on to engine rebuilders in Denver, who kept it and the engine from the Nana for several years as they rebuilt them, and had a very, very excellent running 430 in it at that time. And I had a chance to drive it some, and I realized why Marilyn didn't let anybody else drive it. It had a very small rudder, and when you were coming into the dock or you wanted to slow that boat down and you turned down the revolutions a little bit, and then you tried to turn the boat. It didn't turn. With the huge weight of a 21-foot Continental, it just kept going in the same straight line. And I realized that this wasn't a boat for the kids to be used for water skiing or anything, because it had a mind of its own. So I asked Marilyn if she wouldn't like it back, which she did want it back in running order. And she maintained it for many years, and more recently it has been, the Buttrams have had it refinished, and it's back on the lake in their boathouse. It has a turquoise and black interior. The smaller 18-foot models of that in 1961 are still on the lake. I think there are 2 or 3 of them, and they have garish turquoise and black interior, and they have the white fins, and they're really nice boats, though. They drive nicely, and much better to drive than the 21-foot model. I saw another 3-seater on the lake the other day. A fellow from Vail has a 3-seater Hackercraft down near Rodney Coit's down there. But this is the first new edition 3-seater I've seen. It's called Mary Jane, and I don't know where it comes from. But the bigger models, the 30-footers, often have a different engine sound because they're pushing more weight. Broderick's 3-seater is a replica of the Chris-Craft of about 1930, and Grand-Craft built a series of those about 15 years ago, which were beautiful boats and have a different type of bottom than the Chris-Crafts had. The Chris-Crafts had a oblique inner lining hull, and then the layer of canvas, and then longitudinal boards on the bottom. And you had to put the boat in the water for a few days, and that canvas would soak up, and that would make the bottom tight. More modern boats use a combination of epoxies and marine fiberglass and marine plywood to have what we call a dry hull, or one that you could put in the water and it does not leak. But the old Chris-Crafts take up water pretty quickly, and probably everyone on the lake has their history of a Chris-Craft on the bottom of the lake. They can be pulled back up and restored, however. But the next time, put them on rings for 3 or 4 days after you put them in the water, so that they're protected from sinking.
What kind of boat did you have up here?
Well, I had collected wooden boats for many years because they had no value, and I figured when I retired from orthopedic surgery I would refinish them, but that's a bigger job than I could ever undertake. And so I began to look for the perfect wooden boat, and when Kay and I were in Italy, we went through the Riva, R-I-V-A, Riva factory on Lake Sarnico. It's one of the finger lakes in northern Italy. And I was fascinated at the Italian craftsmanship in building a boat. It's a dry boat. You can put it in the water the first day and it never leaks a drop. It's just perfectly dry. And that's because of the Italian workmanship. If you've seen their woodworking in little boxes they make and things in Italy, they're meticulous. And the same way with building the Riva. The boats are meticulously put together and they don't leak. So Kay and I went through the factory, and Carlos Riva was fascinated that we were from the United States, and so he took my wife Kay around the lake for several hours and showed her all of his boats on the lake. And I said, well, I'd certainly like to have one of these on our little Grand Lake there. Can you build me one? And he said, no, I can't build one of these 21, 22 footers anymore. I've stopped doing that. He said, you'd have to have a 28 footer, and I don't build many of those. So I must have looked a little discouraged, and he said, but I know where there are some recent models that will be for sale, and I'll write you when one becomes available. So we got a letter from him at Christmas, said, I have your Riva Ariston, 21 feet, V8 power, brand new, very little use, I think less than 100 hours on the boat and the engine. And come over next summer and you'll want it, I know. He didn't mention price, but I figure, oh, what the heck, we'll go over next summer and look at it. So we did, and he said, well, I'll, depreciate the price down and make it very reasonable for you, which was less than a Chris Craft would have been in the United States. And he said it's up on Lake Lucerne. It's a freshwater boat. And so I said, well, send it over to us. And so they put it on its original factory cradle and shipped it down the Rhine River to Antwerp, where it spent half a year, and then was another year coming over to Galveston, and by railroad came up. It just fit inside a 16-wheeler. So that's the way they had packed it. And it arrived over at the marina, and Kevin said, now what do I do with a boat inside a 16-wheeler? They took it down to the city dock and towed it back out, and we had it in the boathouse for many, many years.
Do you still have the boat down there?
No, I sold the boat last summer. It's the last of some 30 wooden boats that I had, and I figured the costs of insuring them for their true value was more than a retired doctor can afford, so it was nice not to have the responsibility for it. And I always felt on this side of the lake that the danger from fire was always there, and I would hate to see it. It was such a classic boat that I would hate to have seen it destroyed.
So where did it end up?
It's down in Texas now. The gentleman's brother has the almost identical serial number in the 800s. He built less than 900 of the 21, 22-foot Aristons, and there have been none produced in the last 25 years. I don't know of any Rivas on the lake, nor I don't think there are any in Colorado at the present time. There are quite a few on Lake Geneva in New York and on Lake Tahoe.
Did you give your Riva a name?
It was called the Caroline, and that was kind of a Riva always put the name of a boat in chromium letters on the back of them. In '68, when this one was built, he only built two boats, the 21-foot Riva that we had, and Lamborghini had him build a twin-engine 28-foot, which is signed on the back in chromium letters, Lamborghini, and this one is signed Caroline.
Oh, so you didn't name the boat,
It came with its original name. That's true of most Rivas. Yeah. The chromium names on the back of them are put on to be left permanent. And part of the history of many of the boats. And they went to such interesting people that it's interesting to leave the names on the back of the boat. And Lamborghini still has his Lamborghini with two of his 12-cylinder engines in it. It's a very fast little motorboat. But we see pretty much fiberglass boats being built today, and the quality of them has improved so greatly in the last few years that they are absolutely beautiful. Chris Craft now builds a Capri, which was an old wooden name. The Capris were 2 seats forward, engine hatch in back. They were almost a barrel back, a tumble home in the back. They were very nice boats. The Fry family had one, which they may still have. Theirs has a V8 in it, which makes it nicely powered for Grand Lake. The earlier ones had 6s in them, which was not ideal for water skiing, but they were very beautiful boats. I hope that people maintain some of the wooden boats on the lake. The reproduction boats that are being built today are truly very beautiful, and it's hard to tell them from the original boats. Greg Finch has a Capri built by one of the prime builders of reproduction boats, and it's equipped with a Mercruiser inboard engine and won the power boat races this summer with very little competition. The new reproduction boats are much lighter. They're no soak boats. You don't have to soak them up. They have lots of power. They're nice family boats that anyone can drive with reasonable safety. Muskoka Miss is the name of his boat on Grand Lake, and there are many of the sister boats in the New England area and into Lake Muskoka itself in Canada. Nice to see Mary Jane on the lake as a 3-seater boat. That makes 3 of them that are now on Grand Lake. Broderick's reproduction of a 1930 Chris, the Hacker Craft down near the Morals down in the Cove, and Mary Jane now, and it'll be interesting to see what its history has been.
Who owns the Mary Jane?
I have no idea.
Oh.
I'm sure it was in the boat show, which I didn't get to attend 2 weeks ago, and because it's a new boat to the lake.
Would you like to share any of your personal history? I mean, you've told me about your youth and in Denver, and your friend that you were going to do something together, and you went to different schools. Would you like to share any of that with us?
Well, growing up in Denver made Grand Lake very special to me as a youngster. I came up, I think, in a bassinet the first time, and stayed in Jay and Diane's house on the far side of the lake on the front porch, and I would row her around the west end of the lake while she fished when I was probably 6 or 7 years old.
What was her last name?
Mrs. Barheit.
Oh.
And she and her husband, actually her husband built Jay and Diane's house. It's down 1 or 2 from Rodney Coit. And it's a very modest house with a nice front porch to sleep in. And so as a youngster, I was a guest there many, many summers for short periods. And Grand Lake sort of became a favorite place when we were in the military. We'd find a week or two every summer to come back to Jenny Lemon's Lemon Lodge. And if any of you stayed at Jenny Lemon's, it was a very hospitable place with its beach right next to town. It was a fun place to stay. And she always maintained her Chris Craft, and it was the ski boat in nice condition.
So did you go to East High School?
Once upon a time, I went to East High School. Graduated there in 1950, which I'm trying to think. There aren't many on the lake today whose graduation from high school is back that far. Several of us had the opportunity to go on to college on scholarships, and Princeton was kind enough to grant me a scholarship, so I was able to get my undergraduate education along with several fellows from Denver, Keith Beery from South High and Fred Witzel from East. And those were the days when we refinished the boats from Lakeside, and you had very little investment in them, perhaps $500 or $600 investment in the boat. So you would leave it on the buoy out at Sloan's Lake with the keys in it. And you would take the little dinghy out to it, tie the dinghy on, and take the Chris Craft for a run around the lake, water skiing. Worst experience was with Mason Howard, and more recently an orthopedist in Denver, pulling Mason Howard when we were in medical school. And Sloan's Lake, unlike Grand Lake, is not very deep. It's sort of a muddy bottom. And he took a nosedive into the bottom of the lake, and the skis stuck in the bottom of the lake, and he popped out. So suddenly I had Mace on a line as if I'd been fishing, and he wasn't hurt badly, but the ski was still stuck in the bottom of the lake. And we had to go back and fish it out. But Denver was a nice town to grow up in, and East High, then as now, was a good place to go to school.
So when you got a scholarship to Princeton, was that an athletic scholarship or a scholastic scholarship, or both of them?
I'm not sure it was either one. I just happened to be lucky on the draw, I think. And anyhow, it was sort of a full ride. And those are nice. They were nice in that day, and they're even nicer today. I think both Princeton and Dartmouth are pretty much a full ride scholarship type situation where you get whatever finances you need to go through as you need it, which is really ideal. That way there are no student loans, and the university shares with you the financial responsibility.
Now, didn't you tell me you played football at Princeton?
No.
Oh.
No. My roommate, Fred Witzel, played considerable football. He was back up to Dick Kazmaier, who won the Heisman Trophy. And my other roommate was lead back on the junior varsity. But my athletic experience was very limited.
Okay.
Fred and I both ended up rowing crew and I still guess I love to be on the water. I was in that.
You back on.
We're back on.
You were talking about the Fries, I think.
Howdy and Sissy's and their parents, the senior Fries, were such delightful people from Dallas, Texas, and he took such good care of that of the Chris-Craft they have. It's a Capri, which is a famous name in Chris-Craft history, and that's why they've named their new super fiberglass runabout the Capri. It's a beautiful new fiberglass boat. I haven't seen any on the lake up here, and may not at $70,000 without a trailer. It's a fairly expensive boat, but it's a very beautiful boat, and I'm glad to see Chris-Craft get back into the luxury boat field. An interesting boat on the lake that I recently got a follow-up on was the very first of the fiberglass Chris-Crafts. That was the X-19, which was their first truly fiberglass boat. A ski boat, a runabout. It was a very nice boat, very special. The Newbies had one. David Newby got one when they first came out, and it was on the lake at the Newby place for many years. And they have recently, I think, the family has refinished the boat into show quality. That can be done with the fiberglass boats if you get someone who has worked on Corvettes and is used to doing fine fiberglass work. Those early fiberglass boats had such classic shapes to them. I had several of them, brought them up to Grand Lake. I always seem to have problems with the fiberglass, though. They didn't have the solid feel that a wooden boat has in the water. They always seem to sort of rattle, and even the best makers, Chris-Craft and Century, built a lighter version of a wooden boat. It's unfortunate that the wooden scows are not as competitive with the Melges or Melgus, M-E-L-G-E-S, fiberglass scows, and so they've disappeared from the lake. Dean Lawston has recently refinished the old Dick Miller e-scow, and they're just beautiful interiors. The varnished woodwork inside a 28-foot e-scow is just gorgeous, and they have their disadvantages in that they leak, and they're not fast enough to compete with the fiberglass e's. The first of the Johnson e-scows, e-scow number 1, belongs to the same fellow that has the old Rye boat up in Seattle, and he races it on Lake Washington, but it never wins anything because the wooden boats are slower and than the fiberglass.
So, is that it?
That's it. That's
okay.
As much as I'll ever know about wooden boats until I take one apart again, and I'll find something new that I didn't know about them.
You started talking about the Topeka. Is that the one that was owned by Grace Eslick?
Yes, it is.
Oh.
Eslick had Topeka. Was for sale on the lake about 3 years ago. Was a great boat for a connoisseur to have. It had a sort of a single banger. It a boom, a boom, a boom, and you could hear it on its time schedule around the lake. At, I forget if it was 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock, but Mrs. Eslick was very precise in driving the boat around the lake at that hour. And
I recently saw a picture of her driving the boat, and it was a centerline steering wheel instead of offset to one side or the other. Where most Chris Crafts with the steering wheels on the right or the left, this one was in the middle.
that just attests to the fact that it was a very early Chris Craft. Only the very, very early ones had center steering. And I'm not sure why Chris Craft went to right or left steering. Part of it has to do with the turning of the prop as to whether you have a right or left-hand prop, and also the use they were put to. You like to be able to bring the boat in to the dock and have the passengers get out on the opposite side without climbing over you. So I think there were reasons for right and left-hand drive. Europe is very different as to their right and left-hand drive. They vary between countries. The Swiss have built beautiful wooden boats competitive to Chris Craft, and I think they're totally out of production, the same as they are in the United States.
Okay.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, unfortunately, yes. They are beautiful boats, and you could, if you were on the lake enough, and people followed the same schedule, you would get, at least I would, I could hear the difference in the boats, like the one that John Brooks has. It has a unique, it's a little, probably 6-banger or 4-banger, but it has a unique,
4-banger.
It has a unique sound.
Yes, it does.
You know when John cranks it up.
Yep.
I don't think I've ever seen it go fast. It just is put, 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 put around the lake.
Well, one of the reasons is it doesn't go fast.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Al. And it's been a wonderful Monday afternoon. I think it's August 8th of 2016.
Time flies.